Hello, and the warmest of welcomes to Titanic Echoes TV with me, Mike Prince. Our guest today is Norman Bartlam. Now, Norman is an historian. He's a broadcaster. He makes programs. He teaches, he writes, and probably at some times of the year, above all, he's passionate about his football team, West Bromwich Albion. And so to bring you in, Norman, there's a big day tomorrow, isn't there?
Football is back. Football is back after 106 days and something like 15 hours, 76 minutes or something countdown. Not that I'm worried, of course. Not that I've been counting it.
So, if we weren't sure by just looking at your backdrop, you've got all this memorabilia and photographs of the West Bromwich Albion history, if you like, and both recent and past, I believe. And I just think for the benefit of those watching in times to come, we're recording this during the pandemic. You've already made that obvious. And today is the eve, if you like. This evening will be the eve of June the 20th and a big local derby with the Blues, Birmingham City.
Yeah, West Bromwich Albion is area of the West Midlands called West Bromwich, which some people might not even know that, but hopefully you will do later in the programme. So some people think it's a suburb of Birmingham, but that's the worst thing you can possibly say, is that it's a suburb of Birmingham. It's a distinct area on its own. West Bromwich.
Well, we'll talk about that some more later, and I'm sure you can give us some highlights going back to maybe even the 19th century. But in talking about history and looking back years and hitting that time machine button, what got you interested in history?
I think it was probably at school, really, because just like a lot of people, your interest is gathered with somebody around you that's got passion and enthusiasm and can relate to you and tell you about things that's happening in a nice, friendly way. And I think I probably had a good history teacher at school. And I was also always quite a nosy person, really. I always liked to know what was going on. And when I was growing up, I was born in 58. So early memories obviously date from the early to mid 60s. And that was a time of huge transformation going on in Birmingham. Lots of old buildings being knocked down, lots of clearance of back-to-back houses in the area of Birmingham where I lived and where I was brought up. And it's pretty obvious to me, even as a kid, that things were changing a lot. And all of a sudden, things that I knew of were disappearing. And I was aware at a very early age that was now history. So I started to sort of delve into a little bit more about, I wonder what building used to be there, or I wonder what that building was used for before it was demolished. And started to build up an archive, really, of Birmingham and certain parts of inner city Birmingham in particular, and how it's changed. And most of the changes were taking place in the inner city part of Birmingham, which is where my family were from Handsworth, and my mum from Ladywood, which are two inner city suburbs of Birmingham, really. And tremendous amount of change going on at that time.
So just for those who join us from other parts of the world, Birmingham is at the heart of the UK. It's right in the middle of the country, the furthest big city away from the sea. It's the second biggest city in the UK. And the Industrial Revolution created so much activity in the city that it became known as the town and later the city of 1,000 trades, and many parts of what is now the Commonwealth you'd be seeing made in Birmingham on machinery, on tractors, agricultural machinery, cups and saucers, silverware and whatever. The made in Birmingham was a kind of hallmark. And as I think we both know Andrew Lound, the historian who specialises in the Titanic, 70% of the interior fittings and furniture and glassware and everything came from the West Midlands.
It was just a tremendous industrial area, made particularly lots of small things as well, because Birmingham, as you mentioned, is so far away from the sea that it was very difficult to transport huge pieces of metal and goods and things. So with the canal network, and Birmingham being the centre of the canal network, it was quite easy to transport small items like nuts, bolts, and screws and things. So we weren't necessarily at that stage manufacturing huge, great pieces of machinery, although some of that was taking place. What was happening was we were making components, so we're part of the cog in the wheel of industry, if you like, for the whole of the country.
Just
And
mention for the sake of everyone who's joining in on this conversation, some of the big names. I mean, what I think certainly children and all family members will know Cadbury's and the famous chocolate. But who else kind of grew up, and companies that flourished, not just in the Industrial Revolution, but post the Industrial Revolution, when Birmingham was trading with such strength and might?
well, Cadbury's is the one that everybody always thinks of, isn't it? That's the big name, and it's still going today, even though it's partly American owned now. Well, in fact, fully American owned, isn't it? I think. But back in the Titanic times, there was a fantastic company called Acme Whistles, which is still going today, and they were responsible for the whistles of the famous film of the Titanic. And it's always a very prominent blowing of the whistle, isn't it? Which was made by the Acme company with their whistles. And that's a good example of the small little industries that we were talking about, and how their industry flourished. It was called the Thunderer as well, I think, one of their whistles, wasn't it? And used by companies all over the world. Also in the football world as well, with FIFA, but also through the Ministry of Defence and naval groups all around the world were using their whistles. And even today, they're still used a lot in sport. The FA Cup final referee match every year is also refereed with a whistle from the same company. And other sports as well, like hockey or ice hockey in Canada, all the officials over there, for instance, use these Acme Birmingham-made whistles.
That's fascinating. In fact, before we spoke earlier, I had a look at. You said you were going to mention Acme. I had a look at their website, and their history is incredible in what they've done. As you say, football referees, ice hockey in Canada, all around the world. And
Yeah.
I think that there was an Acme whistle used in the more recent Titanic film, and so they've been there all these years, and good for them, and they're still going.
Been there, done that, as it were, and still are going. Yeah, so I think it's their 150th anniversary this year as well, which is a fantastic thing. And it was all started off by, I think it was Joseph Hudson, and he was only 12 at the time when he started his business. So it just shows sort of the entrepreneurial skills that were going on and the determination that must have been needed for that lad to progress. And he wanted his whistles to be able to command authority, the shrill blast of them. And obviously he himself commanded authority in the end to get into the position where he was, to build up the company to such a fantastic state that it is today.
Well, just one of the manufacturers there. So, Norman, tell us about what you've been doing over the last, couple of decades, I think, to pass on your knowledge to the next generation. I know you've taught, but you've also set up a marvelous enterprise called TNT, the news team, and there are videos online where you encourage youngsters to get involved, make their own videos, and go out and discover local history. How did that come about?
Well, that's again through my teaching in the secondary schools at that stage, and video cameras sort of 30 years ago were quite a novelty. I mean, you talk to children and young people today about video cameras, and everybody's got their own video camera, haven't they? You pick up your mobile phone here, and you've got your own camera. But 30 years ago, never even heard of. So to have something like that, it was fantastic in the state-of-the-art technology. So my school had one of these cameras, but it was locked away in a cupboard really, because they'd got it, but nobody knew how to use it. And anybody that wanted to use it was a bit frightened of using it because they didn't know what they were doing with it. And obviously I was one of those as well. So through a hint of hard work and enthusiasm, really, I suppose you could say, I began to master it, find out how to use the things and to put them to good effect. And then we started going out and recording things that was happening in the local area. Now, at that time, Birmingham city centre, slightly to the edge of the city centre, was an area called Broad Street, where there was a massive old-fashioned Victorian factories, and many of them were pretty derelict and had been for years. And all these were being demolished in the late 1980s. So we started to record the demolition of what was taking place and finding out what was happening in those buildings, then trying to find out what was going to go in their place. And then we started to interview people as well to find out what the plans were, what was going to be built, why was it going to be built there, and what was built was a huge, great big convention centre and a big sports arena, which became one of the state-of-the-art buildings, and also a big concert hall called Symphony Hall, which again was state-of-the-art, and it had got some of the best technology in the world in it. And it was just an unbelievable thing to be happening in Birmingham at that stage. So we thought it was great to be able to sort of record it. And one of the main reasons for doing that, of course, was to preserve it, to preserve the changes, and to be able to show people in years to come just how things were in Birmingham at that stage, and just how much they've changed, and talk about the reasons for changing. And we've got all this material, and lots of people in the local neighbourhood were asking as well about, oh, I wonder what's happening down the road where they're knocking down such and such a factory. And the kids were going home and telling the parents that they'd gone out and filmed it and spoke to the council and spoken to developers about what was going on. And we suddenly realised that the kids actually knew more about what was going on in the local area than the parents did, because there wasn't a great deal of communication with the local people about what was happening. So we started to package our videos into short little news bulletins, and we started to show them in school and then put them onto VHS tape, as it was in those days, and kids took them home to show the parents, and we're getting lots of interest then from people. And the council sort of latched onto it as well, really, and suddenly thought, blimey, we're missing a trick here. Communication, we need to be communicating more with local people and telling them about what's happening in the area, how it's going to benefit them and the changes that are taking place. So the council started having semi-regular meetings with local residents and residents association in the Ladywood area around by where the convention centre was being built. And all those meetings always started off with a 10-15 minute presentation from the kids about what was happening. And they were pretty fearless, of course, because they'd go along and talk to councillors and tell them what they thought, whether they thought it was good what was being built. And if they weren't happy with it, they told them. So it was quite daunting for some of the councillors and some of the developers actually to come along, because that was quite a new thing that was happening in the area at that time.
So you were really a pioneer in what's happening today, because children beginning, 5, 6, 7 and 8 made their own little videos, whether it's with Barbie or whether they go out and do a project when they start going to school. But you were doing it in the days of, you said, VHS, and it prompted interest from the council. It grew from there. So just tell us, folk can go and have a look on the TNT. What's the website address?
There's a website called TNT News. So it's tntnews.co.uk. TNT standing for the news team.
And so if they put in, anyway, if they forget that Norman Bartlam, TNT, the news team, you'll find it. And that's probably a good inspiration to newer generations of teachers who can take a look at, how to get children involved in local history. I know you've done programs and features on where street names came from, and this can apply to any town or city in the world.
Oh yeah,
the famous people, the plaques that go up on houses, so and so was born here or lived here in certain years. And I know that you've been involved in all that kind of involvement and teaching to children. Just so that we can move on, Norman, the thing that has always interested me when we've had our conversations away from TV studios and everything is your great passion for understanding more about World War I in particular. And you've taken children on trips to the Battle of the Somme and the fields and the areas where that took place. Did you find that they were really engaged when they visited?
That's a good question, because everybody asks that question. And lots of people say, oh, kids can't possibly be interested. but nothing could be further from the truth. Because what you need to do is to be able to engage them in such a way that it makes it relevant for them. Too often, history curriculums in school, it's sort of pretty bland, and it just covers things, smooths everything over, just say, oh, there was a war, so what, kind of thing, really. But what you need to do is to pick on individuals, find somebody that you can sort of relate to. So you need to make it local. So, for instance, I've taken lots of groups of Ladywood children to the battlefields in the past, and what we've done is researched it thoroughly beforehand, and perhaps found the name of a person who was killed or did well in the war that lived in a particular street. And we're quite lucky, well, in a sad kind of way, lucky that there were lots of people that lost their lives from inner city Ladywood. So it's virtually impossible not to find the name of a person or a street that you would know. So it's very easy to engage children on that, and they could relate to these people. And you need to do lots of hard work and research through old newspapers and things to try and find out then a little bit about what happened with people. And we linked up quite often with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, because they have got a fantastic website which lists everybody that was killed in the First World War and tells you where they're buried, or where their remains are, or where they're thought to be, or which memorial they're on. So we've based ourselves in Ypres in Belgium at the Menin Gate, and produced quite a few good documentaries, if I say so myself, over the years there, which again, on the website, have also been used in other schools, I know, around the country and around the world. I've had messages from Australia, for instance, as well as America, with people saying that how interested they've been in watching some of the videos.
I think when you start talking about that, as you know, I've spent quite a lot of time in Canada over the years, and there I noticed there's a particularly high interest in what happened during World War One in particular, and the great sacrifice that Canadians made at that time, from Newfoundland right across to the West Coast and British Columbia. So maybe what we ought to grow out of this conversation, Norman, is that we share more of what we've been talking about onto Titanic Echoes, and we give more information, and we can talk and do some further interviews and talk really specifically about World War One and your other interests. But I think World War One is a place to start, because it's so recent in our memories now that we've been marking special dates, and indeed. I think that would be a good way forward with engaging with you. Are you up for that?
Yeah, sounds a great idea, because just off the top of my head, there's one street. Just take one street in Ladywood, for instance. One end of the street, there was a guy who won the Victoria Cross, and at the other end of the street, there was a guy who was one of the first, if in fact the first, to be shot for cowardice. And it turned out later that he wasn't coward. It wasn't a coward at all. It was shell shock, but that wasn't actually recognised at the time until afterwards. And General Haig, leading the troops in the First World War, actually made an example of this guy to say, how can we win the war if we allow people to sort of back out and run away from the trenches like this guy has? So tremendous lessons to be learned from that behaviour of what happened in the First World War. It just shows a tremendous contrast in stories that you can get from one end of the street to the other.
Well, when you think about that period of history, I mean, the Titanic, in comparison to the First World War, I mean, it was a small number of people who tragically lost their lives. But the echoes from Titanic in terms of that period when you had that story, excuse me, of the ship going down, which was one of the first sort of fast news kind of stories that went around the world with the new technology of the time. And then you had the First World War with a huge number of people who lost their lives and families were affected. And then you had Spanish flu, which, I mean, I've read some staggering figures. I haven't found one source that says so many people died, and how would they ever know? but it goes from 100 million, and I've even seen people or articles that say 500 million, just unbelievable numbers of people who lost their lives. So here we are going through this very, very difficult time in 2020. And I know that Spanish flu has been mentioned in articles and on TV programs, but I think it's worth remembering what people went through at that time. And it's good people like yourself who spread that knowledge.
Yeah, quite sad. I mean, lots of the memorials in Birmingham, for instance, have got victims. A lot of them were soldiers that had returned, sailors that had returned from the forces, caught the flu and died, and they're mentioned on some of the war memorials in Birmingham, which is really quite sad.
Well, maybe in our upcoming conversations, we can talk about, do one show entirely about the First World War, and that story, as you said, one street, somebody gets the Victoria Cross, somebody is shot for cowardice, and it would be good if we could start swapping some stories with the folk in Toronto, Montreal, Saskatoon, Vancouver, and the places where there were some very sad things that happened with losing loved ones. And there's an incredible story about Newfoundland, which we can also focus on to see how some of their, the best and the cream of their young men came across and were tragically killed very quickly when they arrived in Europe. So much to talk about. But in this particular interview today, on the eve of the match with Birmingham City and West Bromwich Albion, any predictions, Norman?
For tomorrow's match? It's difficult because there's been such a layoff, but nobody's going to bet against West Brom losing, surely. So it's got to be a West Bromwich Albion victory tomorrow. Yeah, there'll be huge disappointment all around my house anyway. If there isn't a victory for West Brom.
As I think you know, actually, I'm. You know that I'm not an expert or very knowledgeable about football at all, but as it's you, I'll be rooting for the Albion tomorrow, big time, and I will follow the score for you. And on a history note, again, the club was formed way back, was it in the 19th century?
Yeah, the 1870s, 1878, when the club was actually formed. There's this interesting story about the players in a local factory. It was a spring-making factory. Basically, they played cricket in the summer, wanted something to do in the winter, so started kicking the ball about, which happened in lots of places. That's how we came across football. And initially, they were called the strollers because nobody got a ball, so they had to walk some distance to a shop to get a ball. So they little stroll across the lanes, and they became known as the strollers to start with. But that name soon changed. Became West Bromwich Albion, and in Victorian times did exceedingly well, winning the FA Cup on a few occasions. And in fact, the Titanic year, the Titanic month, it's quite interesting from a West Brom point of view, because Albion were having a really good season, doing well in both the Cup, which is the Football Association FA Cup, and also doing particularly well in the league up until the middle of April, around the same week as the sinking of the Titanic. Then after that, they didn't win another game for the rest of the season. Now, obviously, that's got nothing to do with the Titanic. It's sheer coincidence. But Albion then played 7 more games without winning, and also lost an FA Cup final.
Oh dear!
In that week, straight after the Titanic, so it was disastrous on the Albion point of view. So the 1912 FA Cup final, I think it was about a fortnight after the Titanic had sank. But there's a good sportsmanship was shown in that, and West Brom were always known as good sporting players. And 1912, Albion were playing Barnsley in that cup final. It was 0-0. Barnsley broke away, possibility to score, and the Albion captain, who was known as Peerless Jesse Pennington, a fine, upstanding gentleman, had the opportunity to bring his man down and stop a certain goal being scored. But being a gentleman, he didn't exactly wave him by, but he didn't put in a nasty tackle to bring him down and foul him. And the guy broke away and went on and scored. I think he was called Harry Tufnell, the guy. So Barnsley won the FA Cup, but Albion had the moral victory at the end. That's what we always say.
Oh, I love these stories about such events that must have been a huge talking point in the pubs.
Oh, yeah,
afterwards.
indeed.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is as well, it was an interesting thing because lots of the top players then were still gentlemen, shall we say, professionals. And there was a big us and them type, working class versus the upper class type. And some of the more well-known, the more serious of the footballers were still slightly above the working class people. So there was a bit of a us and them thing between them. So the pubs, the working class people in the factories afterwards, I just dread to think what they would be thinking about the lack of not bringing the man down.
This is interesting, Norman, because I've just watched on Netflix a series called the English Game, which goes back to, I think it does go back to the 19th century, and how the FA League was really run by old Etonians.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
The image that you get, I mean, there's a nice end piece which I won't mention now, but resolution. But the way that some of the upper crust, if you like, young men were treating the guys from, well, further north than Birmingham, from the Manchester, Preston, Barnsley area, was, as it's interpreted in the movie or in the series, were not very nice. But there was a good result in the end, let's put it like that. Yeah. The English Game on Netflix. Have you seen it, Norman?
No, I haven't. No, I have heard about it. I'll have to get round to watching it.
Yeah, it's on Netflix, and it's well worth a watch. And in fact, it's not all about football. It's really about the separation of the classes, you know, and how people were viewed anything north of Watford. I mean, for those of you watching in America or Canada, there's a sort of saying by some people that I don't have a lot of respect for, that if you go north of Watford, and Watford is just north of London, it's not very nice, you know, it's all chimney stacks and everything was ridiculous, because of the beautiful countryside and there's some fantastic places to visit. But yeah, I think that both you and I, we've got some definite views about the separation and the regions, and the middle part of England has got some fantastic places to visit.
Indeed.
The Cotswolds, Stratford-on-Avon, and even right in the centre of Birmingham, there's fascinating places to visit. So if you're planning a trip to the UK, do look at the websites that tell you about what goes on in Birmingham, the places to visit, like the famous Black Country Museum, and much more. Well, Norman, I think that's all we've got time for on this particular day. The best of luck for tomorrow's game with the Blues. By the time that this is shared, the result will be known.
Indeed.
And so coming up in weeks and times to come, we'll chat more about the First World War, maybe more about the history of West Bromwich Albion, and many other subjects. So Norman, thank you very much. Stay safe. I'm going to do my usual trick of just looking down, because we're flying solo here, to stop the recording. So for everybody, whenever you watch this, take care and hope you're keeping safe. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.